The Sony A9III has been making waves as of late for being the first full-frame camera in the industry to have a global shutter. Now, if you're watching this review, you've probably already watched tons of other reviews highlighting why the A9III stands out as an action and stills photography camera. But being a little late to the reviews, I'm going to do this one a little differently and focus on the video aspects of the A9III and if it is a viable option as a hybrid camera for users that do both professional videography as well as photography. So what exactly is a global shutter? Traditional cameras use a rolling shutter mechanism where the sensor records information line by line from the top of the sensor to the bottom, and in a nutshell, global shutter camera sensors record all the information at once in a snapshot. When I first heard about this, I was like, great! I finally have a camera that doesn't make my straight lines bend when I'm panning around left to right due to rolling shutter distortion.
So apart from having a global shutter, the A9III also shoots stills at a maximum frame rate of 120 frames per second, making it an excellent camera for anyone that is looking to shoot sports or action sequences when it comes to photography. Apart from that, another new interesting feature that the A9III has is this function called the pre-capture function, and what it basically does is, if you have it turned on, when you have your shutter button half pressed, the camera will recognize that you're getting ready to take a shot and it will already start recording images from then on, which makes it excellent for people that want to capture very fast moving moments, such as if someone is playing baseball and you're getting ready to capture the moment where the batter is almost already ready to hit the ball. You can half press, the camera will start recording at a maximum frame rate of 120 frames per second that allows you to make sure that you actually absolutely get that shot. All really new impressive features from Sony, which I feel is why Sony is at the forefront of this industry. However, what really caught my attention when I found out about the A9III was that the A9III has the ability to shoot 4K 120 without a crop, making it the first alpha series in the line to be able to do so. Before, with other cameras like the A7 IV, which I have tested and reviewed, it does great when it's shooting stills and videos. However, when I'm shooting 4K, there is a crop factor, which was quite a turn off for me when I was transitioning from shooting photos and videos at the same time. So we are now at the Singapore Wake Park filming some test footage with the A9III, and I did have an earlier experience today morning shooting my friend Junior, which was playing softball, and it was my first time experiencing softball. And since the A9III is a sports focused camera, I wanted to capture some fast-moving objects, and it was a perfect opportunity for me to test if there was any rolling shutter distortion, which it should not have since it is a global shutter, and also the AI autofocus. I have to say, even now using the A9III, the first ever camera that I actually had the opportunity to test with the AI autofocus was the A9III, and it still works as great. It is one of my favorite features of all the Sony cameras out there, and I'm waiting for the FX3 II Mark II hopefully to have the AI autofocus as well, but we'll leave that for another review next time. So far, I have brought the A9III out for a couple of professional projects, and today it was a day for me to test it out when in a sports scenario. So myself, I am not a sports photographer, let alone a sports videographer, and I have newfound respect for all people that do sports photography or videos because it is so hard, especially when you have to track people moving around and things are moving so quickly. But because the A9III has the AI autofocus system built into the camera, I did not have to care much about where it was focusing on because it was so interactive. It was really quick. If I wanted to change the focus points, I could just tap on the touch screen and it will change immediately. There were some instances though when I was testing, when I was shooting the softball practice, that the autofocus did not capture the right person, but that's also, I think, due to the fact that there were a couple of people in the frame. You know, the camera particularly didn't know that, okay, I wanted to focus on the person hitting the ball. But regardless of that, I still managed to get some interesting footage. I was shooting both 4K 100 frames, testing out the 120 frames per second on the stills function, and it's really cool because with traditional rolling shutter cameras, or so I've heard with other experienced sports photographers, is that when you have fast moving objects, you tend to have distortion within the frame because the nature of how rolling shutter functions as compared to global shutter is that Global shutter just basically records the whole frame in that 1 second, reading out all the pixels within that sensor at that one moment. So technically, if you're shooting something that's fast moving, it should stop and freeze time in that second. So testing out with the softball match, all the shots where I took of people hitting the bat, I've checked it on this monitor. Even though it's really small, I did manage to find out that there was no distortion at all, which is cool. But with all this talk about global shutter, there are some trade-offs that I do have to mention. Firstly, with the global shutter, the camera is definitely processing a lot more because, as I mentioned before, with a global shutter, your camera is basically taking all the information within the sensor at one time and processing it. So with more processing requires more battery life, and with that comes the possibility of overheating. Throughout my experience with the A9III so far, for about 1+ week now, I have not had any issues at all with the camera overheating. The battery did drain, I would say, not significantly greater than compared to, for example, the FX3, which I'm shooting on right now. But I do have to say, if you want to purchase the A9III, you definitely do have to have a couple of batteries on standby because your camera is going to just be processing a lot more, and that's just the nature of how global shutter cameras work. Secondly, global shutter cameras don't fare as well as their rolling shutter counterparts in terms of dynamic range as well as low light sensitivity because of the extra circuitry required within the camera. But just how much of a difference are we talking about? And that's why we're here outside at night to put the FX3 up against the A9III just to see the difference in terms of noise as well as the dynamic range. Now, I know this is not the best setup in the world, but I previously got chased out of another location, so I had to find this spot last minute just to do this test. But speaking of the test, both cameras will be shooting at the same exact settings, so S-Log3 and all the other settings available that I'll list out on the screen, and at their respective native ISOs. Speaking of which, the A9III's native ISO, if you're shooting an S-Log3, is 2000. So if you're intending to purchase the A9III for video, definitely also purchase a variable ND filter because you're definitely going to need it. I also couldn't find any information about the A9III having dual native ISO, so we're just going to assume that it only has one ISO at this moment, unlike the FX3, which has an native ISO of 800 as well as 12800. And I'm quite curious to see how the A9III performs under the different ISO settings and if there is in fact a dual native. So we're going to put that to the test and just see how it performs in terms of the noise and dynamic range.
At ISO 800, the FX3 is noisier as compared to the A9III at ISO 2000, but that could also be because the scene was way too dark even when I was shooting at f2.8 and I had to adjust the exposure slightly in DaVinci Resolve. But things get a little bit more interesting when we take a look at the close-up of both camera footage. The FX3 definitely has better dynamic range compared to the A9III. There's more separation between the different exposures within the lit up apartments from the FX3, but in the A9III there's less definition and tonality, and it looks a little bit more flat in my opinion. Same goes for the FX3 at ISO 12800 when compared with the A9III's footage at ISO 2000. I continued the test in the studio with slightly more light and pretty much got the same results. The fabric on my floor lamp are more distinct in the FX3, and also the building outside the window has more defined exposure values. The noise from the A9III is pretty much the same as the FX3 now that we are in the studio, even though the scene is still pretty dark, but this time around I didn't adjust the exposure in post. Also, if you're interested, I did test the A9III from ISO 2000 all the way to the maximum ISO of 25600, and throughout the test, the footage progressively got noisier, so I guess it's safe to say that the A9III does not have dual native ISO. So with all this talk about reduced dynamic range and more noise, how does the A9III fare in the real world? In terms of post-production, the footage did come out a lot cleaner than expected when shooting under adequate lighting conditions, and during my color grading process, I didn't find the footage to be noisy to the point that it caused me any issues in achieving the look and the colors that I wanted. Yes, the dynamic range may not be the best, however, I feel that it's adequate enough for anyone that is looking to do professional video work with the A9III. Yes, the footage does get noisy under low light conditions, which is to be expected from a global shutter camera, but unless you're always shooting in low light conditions, I don't think you'll be running into any major issues. In terms of photo resolution, the A9III shoots at 24.6 megapixels, which isn't exactly the highest. However, unless you really pixel peep at the photos, it's really not that obvious to tell. Overall, the images turn out great, and since this is a production unit, I had the opportunity to edit the raw files in Lightroom. And I have to say, The AI autofocus was really nice to use. I was shooting the softball practice with the 7200G Master Mark II, and with the 120 frames per second burst rate combined with the global shutter, I was really able to literally freeze a moment in time when shooting. Notice how there is no warping of the softball when the batter hits the ball, and this is due to the global shutter recording all the pixels at once within the sensor. Here's another instance with a street performer juggling, and the pins were perfectly shaped throughout all my shots. So it all boils down to the question of the day. Is it worth it to spend 8,299 Singapore dollars for the A9 III SA hybrid camera? Definitely a tough question to answer. The A9 III is by no means an entry camera, and in fact, I would classify the camera to be quite niche and only favored amongst photographers that really require that 120 frames per second burst rate as well as the global shutter. But what about the video aspects? No doubt, shooting at 4K 120 without a crop is really nice to use, but apart from that, the A9 III also has up to 8 stops of IBIS, focus breathing compensation, a full-sized HDMI port so you can connect an external monitor easily, and also not to mention, by far the nicest feeling grip in terms of ergonomics in the Alpha series line. All excellent features that make the A9 III a compelling camera for filmmaking. So yes, if you want one camera that can do both photos and videos exceptionally well, then I would say the A9 III is perfect for that. Bonus mention, when you're switching from stills to video mode, there is no 4-second delay. So that wraps up this non-sponsored review of the Sony A9 III on whether it is the perfect hybrid camera for professional users. I hope that you guys found some useful information within this review that will help you in deciding whether or not you want to purchase the A9 III, and I trust that you enjoyed this Ryan Mamba's perspective, and I'll see you guys in the next one.